The text message from Brenda Morrison lit up my phone at exactly 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday night in February, and I knew immediately that this woman was going to make an already terrible situation even worse. Your generator is violating noise ordinances and disturbing the entire neighborhood. I've called the police. Shut it down now. I stared at the screen in disbelief, standing in my garage in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, wearing 3 layers because the temperature outside had dropped to -18 degrees, and the power had been out for 6 hours across half the city. My name is Marcus Brennan, and I've lived in the Riverside Meadows subdivision for 8 years. I'm also the emergency coordinator for our county, a position I'd held for the past 4 years after retiring from the fire department. When the ice storm hit earlier that day, knocking out power to over 40,000 homes, I'd been activated immediately to help coordinate shelter operations and emergency response. I'd just gotten home an hour ago after setting up 3 warming centers across the county, and I'd fired up my generator to keep my pipes from freezing and to maintain a warm space in case any of my neighbors needed help. Brenda Morrison had been the president of our HOA for 2 years, and in that time, she'd transformed from a somewhat annoying stickler for rules into an absolute tyrant who seemed to derive genuine pleasure from making everyone's life miserable. She was 53 years old, always wore her blonde hair in the same tight bun, and had a perpetual expression that suggested she'd just smelled something deeply offensive. She'd recently sent violation notices to old Mrs. Peterson for having her Christmas lights up 2 days past the January 15th deadline. Fined the Rodriguez family $300 because their teenage son's truck was parked on the street overnight when he had the flu and couldn't move it, and tried to force the Chens to remove their vegetable garden because it wasn't aesthetically consistent with neighborhood standards. I texted back quickly, "Brenda, I'm the emergency coordinator. We're in a state of emergency. The generator is running essential equipment and providing a warm space for anyone who needs it. This is literally my job." The 3 dots appeared immediately, then her response, "I don't care what your job is. HOA rules clearly state that generators cannot be run between 10 p.m. and 7 a.m. You're in violation of Section 4.7 Paragraph C. The fine is $500 per day. Police are on their way." I rubbed my face with both hands, feeling the exhaustion settle into my bones. I'd been awake for 19 hours straight. I'd helped evacuate a nursing home when their backup generator failed. I transported a woman in labor to the hospital in my personal truck because the ambulance couldn't get through the ice-covered roads fast enough. I'd coordinated with power crews, emergency services, and the National Weather Service. And now, I was being threatened with fines and police intervention for running a generator during a legitimate emergency. My generator was a Honda EU 7000 IS, one of the quietest models on the market. It was running in my garage with the door closed, powering my furnace, refrigerator, and a few lights. I'd specifically bought this model years ago because it was quiet enough to run in residential areas without causing problems. From the street, you could barely hear it, just a low hum that was quieter than most air conditioners in the summer. The doorbell rang 15 minutes later. I looked through the window and saw a Cedar Rapids Police Department cruiser in my driveway, lights off. I recognized Officer Jamie Torres immediately. We'd worked together on multiple emergency situations over the years. He was a good cop, professional and sensible, and he looked absolutely frozen standing on my porch. I opened the door, and a blast of Arctic air hit me in the face. Jamie was bundled up in his winter uniform, but I could see him shivering. His face was red from the cold and frost had formed on his eyebrows. "Hey, Marcus," he said, his teeth chattering slightly. "Sorry to bother you. Got a call about a noise complaint. Generator running." "Yeah, come inside, man. You look like you're about to freeze to death." I stepped back and gestured for him to come in. Jamie hesitated. "I should probably just take a quick look and file the report." "Jamie, it's -18 degrees outside. Get in here." I pulled him inside and closed the door firmly. The warmth from my house immediately began to thaw the frost on his uniform. He stood in my entryway, stomping his feet and rubbing his hands together. "Okay, yeah, that's better. Jesus, it's cold out there. Our cruiser heater isn't working right and I've been out here for 6 hours straight. We're completely overwhelmed with calls." I led him toward the kitchen where I had coffee brewing. "How bad is it out there?" "Bad. Really bad. We've got multiple car accidents, people trapped in their homes, reports of carbon monoxide poisoning from people running their cars in garages trying to stay warm. 3 house fires from people using their ovens for heat. It's a nightmare." He accepted the mug of coffee I handed him gratefully, wrapping both hands around it. "And somehow, in the middle of all this, I get dispatched to a noise complaint about a generator. Let me guess. Brenda Morrison." Jamie actually laughed, a short bark of disbelief. "How'd you know?" "Wait, stupid question. Of course it was her. She called dispatch 4 times in 20 minutes demanding we send someone immediately. She told them it was an emergency situation, that the noise was so loud it was causing her physical pain, and she couldn't sleep." I walked him to my garage and opened the interior door. The generator hummed quietly in the corner, barely audible even in the enclosed space. Jamie stood there for a moment, listening, then looked at me with an expression of complete disbelief. "You've got to be kidding me. This is what she called about. Marcus, I can barely hear this thing and we're standing right next to it." "That's what I've been trying to tell her. This is one of the quietest generators on the market. It's running essential equipment during a state of emergency. I'm literally doing my job as emergency coordinator." Jamie pulled out his phone and started taking notes. "Okay, so for my report, generator is running in an enclosed garage, doors closed, noise level is minimal. Homeowner is running essential equipment during a declared state of emergency in his capacity as county emergency coordinator. There is no violation of any noise ordinance that I can determine, especially given the emergency circumstances." He looked up at me. "That work for you? Perfectly." "Thanks, Jamie." We walked back into the kitchen, where Jamie lingered over his coffee, clearly in no hurry to get back out into the cold. "So what's the deal with this HOA president anyway? I've been getting calls about her all year. Seems like she's harassing half the neighborhood." I poured myself a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter. "Brenda. She's been on a power trip ever since she got elected HOA president. It started small, just being nitpicky about rules, but it's escalated. She's been fining people for ridiculous things, threatening liens on houses, making people's lives miserable. A lot of the neighbors are scared of her because she can technically fine them into bankruptcy if she wants to. Can't you guys vote her out? We've tried. She's got a couple of allies on the board who back her up no matter what. Linda Kessler and Patricia Whitmore. The 3 of them vote as a block, and they've changed the HOA bylaws to make it almost impossible to remove board members. You need a supermajority of homeowners to show up to a meeting and vote them out, and she schedules all the meetings at weird times when most people can't attend." Jamie shook his head. "That sounds like a nightmare. We've had a lot of calls from your neighborhood lately. Disputes, harassment complaints, that kind of thing, all seem to involve her somehow." Before I could respond, my phone rang. It was my supervisor at the County Emergency Management Office, Director Sarah Chen. I answered immediately. Marcus, we've got a situation. The shelter at Woodbridge Elementary just lost power. Generator failed. We've got 67 people there, including 15 kids and 4 elderly residents with medical conditions. Can you get over there? I looked at Jamie, who was listening to my side of the conversation. How fast do you need me? As fast as possible. We've got another hour, maybe 90 minutes before that building gets too cold to be safe. I'm on my way. I hung up and looked at Jamie. I've got to go. Emergency shelter just lost power. Jamie set down his coffee cup. I'll give you an escort. Roads are really bad, and with my lights, we can get you there faster. You don't have to do that. Marcus, you just gave me coffee and warmth when I was freezing my ass off, and you're going out to help a bunch of people who are in trouble. Yeah, I'm giving you an escort. Let's go. I grabbed my emergency kit, a heavy-duty bag I always kept packed with supplies, tools, and equipment. I made sure my generator was secure and had enough fuel, then headed out to my truck with Jamie following. The cold hit me like a physical force, stealing my breath and making my eyes water instantly. The streets were covered in a thick layer of ice that gleamed under the streetlights. Tree branches, heavy with ice, hung low over the roads, and some had snapped and fallen across yards and streets. Jamie's cruiser led the way, lights flashing, as we carefully made our way through the neighborhood toward the main road. As we passed Brenda Morrison's house, I saw her standing in her front window, lit from behind by what appeared to be candles. She was watching us, her arms crossed, her face set in that familiar expression of disapproval. Her house was dark, meaning she didn't have a generator or power. For a moment, I felt a flash of petty satisfaction, then pushed it away. I didn't have time for that. The drive to Woodbridge Elementary took 45 minutes instead of the usual 15. Jamie navigated the icy roads expertly, and I followed in his tracks. We passed several abandoned cars, their owners apparently having given up and walked to find shelter elsewhere. Power lines were down in several places, and we had to detour twice to avoid blocked roads. When we arrived at the school, the building was dark except for emergency lighting in a few windows. I could see people huddled in the gymnasium, wrapped in blankets. The temperature inside was probably already down to the 50s, and it would keep dropping. I grabbed my kit and headed inside, where I found the shelter coordinator, a woman named Michelle Harper who worked for the Red Cross. Marcus, thank God. The generator quit about 30 minutes ago. We've tried everything, but it won't restart. I think it's the cold, or maybe it's just old. We need to either get it running or evacuate these people, and I don't know where we'd take them. Every other shelter is at capacity. I followed her to the generator, which was set up in a utility room at the back of the building. It was an old diesel unit, probably 20 years old, and when I examined it, I immediately saw the problem. The fuel had gelled in the cold. Diesel fuel contains paraffin wax that can solidify when temperatures drop too low, clogging filters and fuel lines. It was a common problem in extreme cold, and it was fixable, but it would take time. I need to warm this up and treat the fuel, I told Michelle. It's going to take at least an hour, maybe 2. Can we keep people safe that long? She looked worried. I don't know. We've got some elderly folks who aren't doing well. Mr. Patterson has copped, and the cold is really affecting his breathing. Mrs. Liu has diabetes, and she needs to keep her insulin at the right temperature. And those kids need to stay warm. I made a decision. Call Jamie Torres. He's outside. Tell him I need him to transport the most vulnerable people to the hospital or another heated location. Meanwhile, I'll get this generator running. For the next 90 minutes, I worked on that generator in the cold utility room, my fingers going numb despite my gloves. I used a space heater I found in a closet to warm the fuel tank and lines. I replaced the fuel filter. I added fuel additives to prevent further gelling. I checked every connection, every line, every component. Jamie made 2 trips to transport the elderly residents and the smallest children to other locations. Other officers arrived to help, including a sergeant named Mike Donnelly who brought additional supplies. Finally, at 2:30 in the morning, the generator coughed to life. The lights came on, the furnace started humming, and I heard cheers from the gymnasium. I was exhausted, covered in diesel fuel and grease, and my entire body ached from the cold and the awkward positions I'd been working in. But people were safe and warm, and that was what mattered. Jamie drove me back home at 3:15 a.m. We were both too tired to talk much, but as he pulled into my driveway, he said, "You did good tonight, Marcus. Those people would have been in real trouble without you. Just doing my job." "Yeah, well, your HOA president could learn something from you about what actually matters." I trudged into my house, grateful for the warmth, and collapsed into bed without even taking off my clothes. The generator in my garage continued its quiet hum, keeping everything running, keeping my house safe. I woke up 6 hours later to my phone buzzing incessantly. Multiple text messages and missed calls. I grabbed the phone groggily and started reading through them. Most were work-related, updates on the emergency situation, which was slowly improving as power crews worked around the clock. But there were also 3 messages from Brenda Morrison, each more aggressive than the last. "Your generator was running all night. That's a $500 fine. I have documented evidence of your violation. You will be hearing from our HOA attorney. You think being an emergency coordinator puts you above the rules. You're not special. Pay your fine or face legal action." There was also a message from my neighbor, Tom Wilson, who lived 2 doors down. "Hey Marcus, heads up. Brenda was going door to door this morning asking people to sign a petition to have you removed from the neighborhood for repeated violations and disturbing the peace. I didn't sign it, but I think she got a few signatures from people who don't know the full story. She's also taking pictures of your house and generator. Watch out for her." I sat up in bed, anger starting to replace my exhaustion. This was getting out of hand. I'd spent the last 24 hours working to keep people safe during a crisis, and Brenda was treating me like a criminal, because my generator, which was barely audible, had been running during a state of emergency. I got up, showered, and made breakfast. The power was still out in my neighborhood, but my generator was handling everything I needed. I checked the fuel level and added more, ensuring it would keep running. Then, I started making phone calls. First, I called my attorney, Robert Mallory, who'd helped me when I'd bought my house and had dealt with various legal matters over the years. I explained the situation, and he listened without interrupting. "Okay, so a few things," he said when I finished. "First, during a declared state of emergency, most noise ordinances are suspended or at least not enforced, especially for equipment being used for safety purposes. Second, as the county emergency coordinator, you have certain protections and authorities that supersede HOA regulations in emergency situations. Third, this HOA president sounds like she's potentially engaging in harassment, which could be a legal issue for her. Forward me all her messages, any documentation you have, and let me look into this." I felt a little better after talking to Robert. Next, I called Sarah Chen at the Emergency Management Office to give her an update on the shelter situation and to let her know what was happening with my HOA. "Are you serious?" Sarah said, her voice incredulous. "She called the cops on you while you were providing emergency services. Marcus, you saved lives last night. That generator at the school could have been out all night if you hadn't fixed it. Those elderly residents could have been in serious danger. I know, but she doesn't care about any of that. She just sees that I violated an HOA rule. Let me make some calls. This is ridiculous. The power came back on in my neighborhood around noon. I shut down my generator, pleased that it had performed flawlessly for over 12 hours. I'd need to do some maintenance on it, but it had done exactly what I needed it to do. As I was cleaning up my garage, I saw Brenda walking up my driveway, clipboard in hand, Linda Kessler and Patricia Whitmore flanking her like backup singers in a very angry band. I walked out to meet them at the end of my driveway, not wanting them any closer to my house than necessary. "Mr. Brennan," Brenda said formally, as if we were in a courtroom instead of standing on a residential driveway in Iowa. "I'm here to formally deliver notice of your violations and associated fines. You ran a generator between the hours of 10 p.m. and 7 a.m., which is a direct violation of HOA Regulations Section 4.7 Paragraph C. The fine is $500 for each day of violation. Since your generator ran for 2 separate days, that's $1,000 total. Brenda, we were in a state of emergency. The power was out. I'm the county emergency coordinator. My generator was running essential equipment and providing a warm space for anyone who needed it. This is literally my job, and it's protected under emergency management statutes." Linda Kessler, a thin woman in her late 50s with steel gray hair, spoke up. "HOA regulations don't have exceptions for so-called emergencies. If we let one person break the rules, everyone will want to break the rules. So-called emergencies." I stared at her. "Linda, people died last night. 3 elderly people died from hypothermia in their homes because they didn't have heat. There were multiple house fires. A nursing home had to be evacuated. This wasn't a so-called emergency. This was a real crisis." Patricia Whitmore, a heavy-set woman with short brown hair, shook her head. "That's very sad, but it doesn't change the HOA regulations. You agreed to follow these rules when you bought your home here. You don't get to pick and choose which rules you follow." I took a deep breath, trying to remain calm. "I'm not paying this fine. It's illegitimate, it's unreasonable, and it's potentially illegal given the circumstances. I've already spoken to my attorney and he's looking into this." Brenda's face flushed red. "If you don't pay the fine within 30 days, we'll place a lien on your house. We have the authority to do that under the HOA bylaws. Eventually, we can force you to sell your home to pay the debt. I suggest you take this seriously." "Oh, I'm taking it very seriously. I'm taking it so seriously that I'm going to make sure everyone in this neighborhood knows exactly what you're doing. I'm going to make sure they know that while I was out helping people during an emergency, you were more concerned about enforcing petty rules than about the safety and welfare of your neighbors." "Are you threatening me?" Brenda's voice went up an octave. "I'm informing you. There's a difference." She thrust a piece of paper at me, which I took but didn't look at. "You've been served with notice of violation. Have a nice day, Mr. Brennan." The 3 women turned and walked away, their heads together, already talking among themselves. I went back inside and immediately forwarded the notice to my attorney. Robert called me back within an hour. "This is worse than I thought," he said. "I've been reading through your HOA's bylaws, and they've made some changes in the past 2 years that are potentially illegal. They've given themselves the authority to levy fines without any real oversight or appeal process. They've removed provisions that protected homeowners' rights, and they've structured the voting system so that it's almost impossible to remove board members or challenge their decisions. This is borderline authoritarian, and I think it might actually violate Iowa state law regarding HOA governance." So what do I do? First, don't pay the fine. Second, I'm going to file a formal complaint with the Iowa Real Estate Commission, which oversees HOAs in the state. Third, I'm going to request a formal review of your HOA's bylaws and recent changes. And fourth, I think you should consider organizing the other homeowners. I'm willing to bet you're not the only person who's being harassed by this woman and her board. Over the next week, I started talking to my neighbors. What I discovered shocked me. Brenda and her board had been systematically harassing and fining residents for minor or sometimes completely fabricated violations. The Rodriguez family had been fined over $2,000 in the past year for various infractions, including having their grass too tall when it was measured at exactly 3 inches, which was the maximum allowed height. They'd been fined on a Monday after mowing on the previous Saturday because their grass had grown slightly over the weekend. Mrs. Peterson, the elderly widow who'd been fined for her Christmas lights, was now facing additional fines for having discolored siding on one corner of her house, where the sun had faded the paint slightly. The fine was $100 per week until she repainted the entire house, which would cost her thousands of dollars she didn't have on her fixed income. The Chen family had been fined for their vegetable garden, then fined again when they'd converted it to flowers, because the flowers were supposedly not approved species, according to a list that Brenda had created but never distributed to residents. They were now facing over $3,000 in fines. Young couple named David and Emma Foster had been fined because their toddler's plastic play set in the backyard was supposedly visible from the street, which violated aesthetic standards. They'd moved the play set and then been fined again because moving it had created worn patches in their grass. I talked to 17 different families over the course of a week, and every single one had a story about being harassed, fined, or threatened by Brenda and her board. Many were scared to speak up because they feared retaliatory fines or legal action. Some had actually paid thousands of dollars in what I considered to be illegitimate fines just to make the harassment stop. I also learned something else interesting. Brenda, Linda, and Patricia had formed a company called HOA Management Solutions and had contracted with our HOA to provide management services for a fee of $5,000 per month. Essentially, they were paying themselves with HOA dues to run the HOA. This wasn't necessarily illegal, but it was a serious conflict of interest, and it explained why they were so aggressive about collecting fines. The more money the HOA collected, the more they could pay themselves. I brought all this information to Robert, who reviewed everything carefully. This is a pattern of harassment and possibly fraud. The self-dealing with the management company is particularly problematic. I think we need to bring this to the attention of the authorities. What authorities? Well, for starters, the Iowa Real Estate Commission. But depending on what we find, potentially the Attorney General's office. If they're using their position on the HOA board to enrich themselves while harassing residents, that could be criminal. I also reached out to Officer Jamie Torres, who'd been helpful during the generator incident. He met me at a coffee shop downtown, and I explained what I'd discovered. "That's concerning," Jamie said, taking notes. "The harassment part is tricky because it's civil rather than criminal, but the potential fraud with the management company could be another matter." "Have you documented everything?" "I've got copies of fine notices, emails, text messages, photographs, and written statements from 17 different families. Robert, my attorney, has everything. Let me talk to our white-collar crime unit. They might be interested in looking into this." 2 weeks after the ice storm, I received a certified letter from the HOA attorney demanding payment of my $1,000 fine, plus an additional $500 in administrative fees and $300 in legal fees. The letter stated that if I didn't pay within 10 days, they would proceed with placing a lien on my property. I forwarded the letter to Robert, who responded with his own letter to the HOA attorney. He laid out the legal arguments for why the fine was invalid, cited the state of emergency declaration, referenced my position as emergency coordinator, and included copies of the Iowa statutes that protected emergency responders from this kind of harassment. He also mentioned that we were aware of the potential conflicts of interest and questionable financial practices within the HOA board, and suggested that they might want to drop the matter before it escalated further. The HOA attorney responded by doubling down, sending another letter that was even more threatening. They claimed my attorney's letter was frivolous and that they would seek additional damages if I continued to refuse payment. Meanwhile, I'd been organizing the other homeowners. I'd reached out to everyone I'd interviewed and several others who'd heard what was happening. We scheduled a meeting at the community center, which was neutral territory outside the HOA's control. 43 homeowners showed up, which was more than half the neighborhood. I stood up in front of the group and laid out everything I'd learned. I showed them the pattern of harassment, the questionable fines, the self-dealing with the management company, and the changes to the bylaws that had stripped away homeowner protections. People were angry. Many had been suffering in silence, thinking they were alone, and discovering that nearly everyone had been targeted was a catalyst for action. "So what do we do?" asked David Foster, the young father whose play set had caused so much controversy. Robert stood up and addressed the group. "First, we file a formal complaint with the Iowa Real Estate Commission. I've already started that process. Second, we organize a recall election. Under Iowa law, you can recall an HOA board with a majority vote of homeowners. Brenda has tried to make this difficult, but she can't override state law. Third, if we find evidence of actual fraud or embezzlement, we report it to law enforcement." "But she'll retaliate," said Mrs. Peterson, her voice shaky. "She'll fine us all even more." "Let her try," I said. "If she retaliates against people for exercising their legal rights, that's additional evidence of harassment. We document everything. We save every email, every text, every letter, and we stand together. She can't terrorize all of us at once." The group voted unanimously to move forward with the recall election and the complaint to the Real Estate Commission. We formed a committee to organize the recall, set a date for the election, and started spreading the word to every homeowner in the neighborhood. Brenda's response was swift and predictable. Within 3 days, 12 different homeowners received violation notices for various infractions. My next-door neighbor, Steve Murphy, was fined for having a non-conforming mailbox, even though he'd had the same mailbox for 15 years. The Santos family was fined for parking their hybrid car on the street overnight, something that had never been an issue before. It was blatant retaliation, and it only made people angrier. The recall election was scheduled for a Saturday morning, 6 weeks after the ice storm. Under Iowa law, we needed a simple majority of homeowners to vote in favor of recalling the board members. We had 72 homes in our HOA, so we needed 37 votes. Brenda tried to challenge the election, claiming it violated HOA procedures, but Robert filed an emergency motion with the district court, and a judge ruled that the election could proceed under state law. The morning of the election, I arrived at the community center early to help set up. We'd arranged for an independent mediator to oversee the voting to ensure everything was fair and transparent. Homeowners started arriving at 9 a.m., and by 10 a.m., we had a steady stream of people coming through to cast their votes. Brenda showed up at 10:30 with Linda and Patricia, along with the HOA attorney. They tried to disrupt the proceedings, claiming the election was invalid, but the mediator shut them down, showing them the court order that authorized the election. "This is a coup," Brenda declared loudly, her face red with anger. "You're all being manipulated by Marcus Brennan, who thinks he can do whatever he wants because of his little emergency coordinator job. He broke the rules, and now he's trying to avoid the consequences by turning everyone against me." Tom Wilson, my neighbor who'd warned me about Brenda's petition, stood up. "Brenda, you fined me $800 last year because my fence was supposedly 6 inches too tall. I had it professionally measured, and it was exactly the height specified in the regulations. You made me pay anyway, and when I challenged it, you threatened to put a lien on my house. This isn't about Marcus. This is about you abusing your power." Other people started speaking up, sharing their stories. The room filled with angry voices, all directed at Brenda and her board. The mediator had to call for order several times. Brenda, Linda, and Patricia left after about 20 minutes, apparently unable to handle the hostility. By 2 p.m., the voting was complete. The mediator counted the ballots in front of witnesses from both sides. The results were overwhelming. 61 homeowners voted to recall the entire board. Only 8 voted against the recall. 3 abstained. The recall was successful. Brenda Morrison, Linda Kessler, and Patricia Whitmore were officially removed from the HOA board. The election also included a vote for new board members, and I was elected president along with 4 other homeowners who'd been active in organizing the recall. But the story didn't end there. Robert had continued investigating the financial arrangements, and what he found was worse than we'd initially thought. The HOA Management Solutions Company had been billing the HOA for services that were never provided. Invoices for landscape consulting, architectural review services, and administrative support totaled over $80,000 over the past 2 years, but there was no evidence that any of these services had actually been performed. The money had simply been paid to Brenda, Linda, and Patricia's company. Additionally, several of the fines that had been collected had never been properly deposited into the HOA accounts. Over $15,000 in fine money had simply disappeared. Robert suspected it had been pocketed by the board members, but proving it would require a forensic audit. We filed a formal complaint with the Iowa Attorney General's office, including all the documentation Robert had gathered. The AG's office opened an investigation into potential embezzlement and fraud. We also filed a civil lawsuit seeking to recover the money that had been improperly paid to HOA Management Solutions and demanding an accounting of all fine money collected. The investigation took 4 months. During that time, the new HOA board worked to repair relationships in the neighborhood and reform the policies that had caused so much trouble. We reduced fine amounts to reasonable levels, created a real appeals process for disputed violations, and removed many of the petty rules that had been used to harass residents. We refunded all the fines that had been levied for questionable violations, which totaled over $30,000. We also dissolved the contract with HOA Management Solutions and began managing the HOA ourselves with volunteer board members. In June, the Iowa Attorney General's office announced charges against Brenda Morrison, Linda Kessler, and Patricia Whitmore. They were each charged with theft in the second degree, a Class D felony in Iowa, for embezzling HOA funds. They were also charged with fraudulent practices for the fake invoices from HOA Management Solutions. The case went to trial in September. I testified about my experience with the generator incident and the pattern of harassment I'd witnessed. 17 other homeowners also testified. The forensic accountant who'd reviewed the HOA's finances testified about the missing money and the fraudulent invoices. It was damning testimony that painted a clear picture of 3 women who'd used their positions to enrich themselves while terrorizing their neighbors. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Brenda, Linda, and Patricia were each sentenced to 5 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 18 months. They were also ordered to pay restitution of over $95,000 to the HOA. The civil lawsuit was settled out of court. Brenda's homeowner's insurance covered part of the damages, and the 3 women agreed to pay the remainder over time. The HOA recovered almost all the money that had been stolen or improperly paid. As for me, my life returned to a relatively normal routine. I continued my work as emergency coordinator, responding to various emergencies throughout the county. The generator incident became something of a legend in local emergency management circles, a story about bureaucratic absurdity in the face of real crisis. Jamie Torres and I became good friends, and we still grab coffee occasionally to swap stories about the crazy things we see in our jobs. The neighborhood changed too. With the oppressive HOA leadership gone, people started to relax and enjoy their homes again. Mrs. Peterson planted a beautiful flower garden that's slightly visible from the street, and nobody cares. The Chen family expanded their vegetable garden, and they share their produce with neighbors every summer. The Foster kids play in their backyard on their plastic play set without fear of generating fines. The Rodriguez family's son parks his truck on the street whenever he needs to, and it's not a problem. We still have an HOA because we need one to maintain common areas and handle certain neighborhood issues, but it's become what it should have been all along. A helpful organization that serves the residents rather than ruling over them with an iron fist. We meet once a quarter, we discuss actual issues that matter, and we make decisions together as a community. Sometimes, on cold winter nights, I run my generator to test it and make sure it's ready for the next emergency. It sits in my garage, humming quietly, and I think about that February night when a power-hungry HOA president called the cops on me for doing my job. I think about Officer Jamie Torres shivering on my porch, grateful for warmth and coffee. I think about the people at that shelter who needed help and how close they came to being in serious danger. I learned a lot from that experience. I learned that standing up to bullies is necessary, even when it's difficult and risky. I learned that community matters, that neighbors helping neighbors is more important than rigid adherence to arbitrary rules. I learned that most people are reasonable and decent when given the chance, and that the few who abuse power will eventually face consequences. I also learned that sometimes the most important emergencies aren't the obvious ones like ice storms and power outages. Sometimes the emergency is slower and quieter, like a neighborhood being poisoned by harassment and fear. And sometimes responding to that emergency requires a different kind of courage. The courage to speak up, to organize, to stand together against injustice. My generator is ready now, fueled and maintained, sitting quietly in my garage. It's there for the next ice storm, the next power outage, the next crisis. But more importantly, I'm ready too. I know what matters. I know what's worth fighting for. And I know that a community that stands together can overcome almost anything. even an HOA president named Brenda who thought rules were more important than people. The following spring, we held a neighborhood barbecue to celebrate the first anniversary of the recall election. Over 60 people showed up, including families who'd been too scared to attend neighborhood events when Brenda was in charge. Kids ran around playing while adults grilled burgers and swapped stories. Officer Jamie Torres stopped by in his patrol car, off-duty but still in uniform, and people thanked him for his help during the ice storm and the investigation that followed. Mrs. Peterson brought a cake decorated with a picture of my generator, which everyone thought was hilarious. Tom Wilson gave a short speech thanking everyone who'd had the courage to stand up and demand change. David Foster's kids played in a bounce house we'd rented, their laughter echoing through the neighborhood that had once been so silent and fearful. As the sun set and people started heading home, I stood in my driveway and looked around at the neighborhood. Houses with slightly different paint colors, mailboxes that didn't all match, gardens planted with vegetables and flowers that hadn't been approved by any committee. It was messy and imperfect and real, and it was beautiful. That's what a neighborhood should be, I thought. Not a sterile collection of identical houses governed by petty rules, but a living community where people can be themselves, help each other, and build real relationships. The generator incident had been the catalyst, but what had really changed the neighborhood was people deciding they'd had enough of being afraid and choosing to stand together. I went inside that evening and sat down to write a report for the county about emergency preparedness. Part of my job involved helping people and organizations prepare for disasters, and I'd learned something important from the past year. Real preparedness isn't just about having generators and supplies and emergency plans. It's about building resilient communities where people know their neighbors, trust each other, and are willing to help when times get tough. That ice storm had tested our community in ways I hadn't expected. Yes, it had tested our infrastructure and our emergency systems and our ability to keep people safe in dangerous conditions. But it had also revealed the deeper problem in our neighborhood, the erosion of trust and community caused by authoritarian leadership and petty tyranny. Fixing that problem had ultimately made us stronger and better prepared for whatever challenges might come next. I finished my report and sent it off to my supervisor. Then I checked on my generator one more time, making sure it was ready for the next emergency. Because there would be a next emergency, there always was. But I was confident that when it came, our neighborhood would be ready. Not just because we had the right equipment, but because we had something more important. We had each other. The legal proceedings continued for several more months after the trial. Brenda, Linda, and Patricia all filed appeals, claiming various procedural errors and arguing that they'd been unfairly targeted. Each appeal was denied. They also tried to sue several homeowners, including me, for defamation and conspiracy, claiming we'd orchestrated a campaign to destroy their reputations. That lawsuit was dismissed with prejudice, and they were ordered to pay our legal fees. In prison, Brenda apparently became just as difficult with the correctional staff as she'd been with the neighborhood. I heard through the grapevine that she tried to organize the other inmates to file grievances about trivial matters, attempting to recreate her little kingdom behind bars. It didn't work out well for her. Prison operates on a different set of rules than an HOA, and the other inmates didn't appreciate her attempts to boss them around. The 3 women were released after serving 18 months, the minimum sentence. They moved away from Cedar Rapids almost immediately. I heard Brenda relocated to Arizona, Linda to Florida, and Patricia to somewhere in Texas. I hoped they'd learned something from their experience, but I wasn't particularly optimistic. Some people never learn. The civil restitution payments came in slowly but steadily. The HOA used the money to fund improvements that actually benefited residents. Repaving the neighborhood streets, upgrading the playground at the park, installing better lighting along the walking paths. Every improvement was voted on by the homeowners, and every financial decision was transparent and documented. We published monthly financial reports so everyone could see exactly where their HOA dues were going. We also created a Community Emergency Preparedness Committee, which I chaired. We organized training sessions on winter safety, fire prevention, and emergency planning. We set up a neighborhood communication system using a phone tree and a private social media group, so we could quickly share information during emergencies. We identified residents who had generators and created a list of warming centers where people could go if their power went out. We even purchased a large generator for the community center so it could serve as an emergency shelter if needed. The committee became one of the most active and appreciated parts of the HOA. People enjoyed the training sessions and appreciated knowing they had neighbors they could turn to if something went wrong. We also organized social events like the spring barbecue, summer movie nights in the park, and a winter lights festival. The neighborhood became a real community instead of just a collection of houses governed by rules. My friendship with Officer Jamie Torres continued to grow. We started a tradition of meeting for coffee every couple of weeks to catch up and decompress from the stresses of our jobs. Jamie had been promoted to sergeant, partially based on his excellent work during the ice storm and the subsequent investigation of the HOA fraud. He still patrolled our area sometimes, and he'd often stop by just to check in and say hello. One cold evening in January, almost 2 years after the generator incident, Jamie stopped by my house while I was in the garage doing maintenance on my generator. He watched me work for a few minutes, then laughed and shook his head. "You know, I still can't believe that whole situation. I mean, I've responded to a lot of ridiculous calls in my career, but getting dispatched to a noise complaint about a generator during an ice storm when the homeowner is literally the emergency coordinator. That's got to be top 5 absurd calls of all time." I wiped grease off my hands and grinned at him. "Yeah, but look at what came out of it. If Brenda hadn't called the cops on me, we might never have organized to remove her. She might still be running this neighborhood like her personal fiefdom, stealing money and making everyone miserable." That's true. Sometimes the bad guys do something so stupid that it ends up being their downfall. Jamie accepted a bottle of water I offered him and leaned against my workbench. "You hear about the lawsuit she filed against the city?" "What? No, I hadn't heard about that." "Yeah, she's suing the police department, claiming we violated her civil rights by investigating her and providing evidence to the Attorney General. It's completely frivolous, and it'll get thrown out, but she's making noise about it." I shook my head. Some people never learn. She can't accept that she did something wrong, so she's trying to blame everyone else. Pretty much. The city attorney isn't worried about it. We've got solid documentation of everything we did, and we followed proper procedures. It's just annoying because it wastes everyone's time. We talked for a while longer, then Jamie headed back out on patrol. I finished working on the generator, tested it to make sure everything was running smoothly, and then shut it down and closed up the garage. As I walked back into my house, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction and contentment. My neighborhood was in a good place. The people who'd caused so much trouble were gone and facing the consequences of their actions. And I'd played a role in making it all happen, not because I'd sought out conflict, but because I'd stood up for what was right when it mattered. The lawsuit against the city was indeed dismissed a few months later, just as Jamie had predicted. Brenda was ordered to pay the city's legal fees, adding to her already substantial financial obligations. I didn't take any pleasure in her continued struggles, but I didn't feel sorry for her either. She'd made her choices, and now she was living with the consequences. Life continued in its normal rhythm. I responded to various emergencies in my capacity as emergency coordinator. A tornado warning in April that thankfully didn't result in any touchdowns. A chemical spill at a factory in May that required evacuating nearby neighborhoods. A flash flood in July that trapped several people in their cars. Each emergency was different. Each one required different skills and responses, and each one reinforced my belief in the importance of preparation and community. The neighborhood continued to thrive. New families moved in, attracted by the reasonable HOA policies and the strong sense of community. When new residents joined, we made sure to welcome them properly and explain how our HOA worked. We told them the story of Brenda and the reforms we'd implemented, not to gossip or complain, but to make sure they understood that the HOA existed to serve them, not the other way around. Mrs. Peterson became something of a neighborhood grandmother, always ready with cookies for the kids and advice for anyone who needed it. The Chen family opened a small farm stand in their driveway during the summer, selling vegetables and flowers to neighbors and passers-by. The foster kids grew up playing with other neighborhood children in yards and parks, their laughter a constant background soundtrack to the neighborhood. The Rodriguez family's son graduated from college and got a job as an engineer, and the family threw a big celebration party that half the neighborhood attended. These were the things that mattered. Not whether grass was exactly the right height, or whether mailboxes all matched, or whether play sets were visible from the street. What mattered was people building lives together, supporting each other, and creating a place where everyone felt welcome and valued. I continued to maintain my generator carefully, testing it regularly and keeping it fueled and ready. I hoped I'd never need it again for a major emergency, but I knew better than to count on that hope. Emergencies happen. Ice storms hit. Power goes out. People need help. And when those moments came, I wanted to be ready. But I also understood now that being prepared wasn't just about equipment and supplies. It was about relationships, trust, and community. It was about knowing your neighbors well enough to know who might need help when things go wrong. It was about building systems and networks that could activate quickly when crisis struck. It was about creating a culture where people looked out for each other instead of just looking out for themselves. The generator incident had taught me all of that. It had started as an absurd confrontation with a petty tyrant who cared more about rules than people. But it had evolved into something much larger and more meaningful. A transformation of an entire community from fear and isolation to trust and connection. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I just paid Brenda's fine, if I'd backed down and accepted her authority. The HOA board would probably still be in power, still harassing residents, still stealing money. The neighborhood would still be a fearful, miserable place where people kept their heads down and tried not to attract attention. I'm glad I didn't take that path. Standing up to bullies is never easy. It takes courage, persistence, and often a willingness to endure conflict and discomfort. But it's necessary. Because when good people stay silent and allow bad people to maintain power, everyone suffers. The only way to create change is to speak up, stand together, and refuse to accept injustice even when it comes disguised as rules and regulations. My generator sits in my garage now, quiet and ready. It's a tool, a piece of equipment that converts fuel into electricity. But it's also more than that. It's a symbol of preparedness, of readiness to help when help is needed. And it's a reminder of a cold February night when everything changed, when a ridiculous noise complaint became the catalyst for transformation. I'm proud of what our neighborhood accomplished. I'm proud of the people who found their courage and stood up against harassment and abuse. I'm proud of the systems we built to prevent similar problems in the future. And I'm proud that when crisis came, I was ready to do my job, to help people, to make a difference, despite someone trying to stop me for all the wrong reasons. That's what it means to be part of a community. It means showing up when you're needed. It means standing up when something is wrong. It means putting people before rules and compassion before regulations. It means being willing to fight for what's right, even when it's difficult and costly and risky. The generator is ready. The neighborhood is strong. And I'm prepared for whatever comes next, not just because I have the right equipment, but because I have something far more valuable. I have neighbors who trust me, support me, and stand with me. And together, we can weather any storm.